All right, welcome everybody. A brand new season. It's all the same schedule though. Every week on Wednesdays, we'll be doing Opposition Wednesday, where we get a little bit closer to find out what's going on. Today, for that, we have Darren Urban. Darren, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Very good. 24 years on the beat. I think 2007, I saw you started with the actual Cardinals. What do you think the biggest difference in the way you've covered the team has changed in that time period?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, since I started covering the team, I mean, the internet wasn't really even a thing at the very beginning, and social media certainly wasn't around. I mean, when I first started doing this, I worked for a morning newspaper, and that's how the news got out every day. Was you were waiting for that paper to come out on the next morning to see what the story would be. And obviously that's changed dramatically to the point where everything is now. And to be honest, one of the reasons I'm, I took this job working for the team was because that things were not going in the right direction for newspapers. And I needed to make sure that I had a soft landing space before I ended up without a job. So that also is a big part of it.
Do you prefer writing to, say, podcasting or the visual medium?
I mean, ultimately, I would say yes. I went to school to work as a sports writer on a newspaper way back in the day. So I've always loved writing. I still love writing. I feel like I've gotten pretty decent at either being on camera or talking in a podcast. So obviously with reps, that's going to improve. But I still think my biggest strength is my writing and how I would organize a story, how I would tell a story.
Where do you think we're headed next?
With that, that's a great question. One of the things I struggle with a little bit when younger people ask me about getting into this line of work and doing it, not only is it drastically different in terms of how um, how the business goes, but I mean, when you're doing this, your aim is not only to do something you love, your aim is also to make a living and to have a family. And unfortunately, the way things are going with a lot of this stuff, there isn't a lot of money to be made. Uh, for instance, with this covering sports, there are still jobs, but when you talk about all the newspaper jobs that have been lost, all the local television stations that no longer do sports the way they did or cut down from 3 people to 1 person, there's a lot less opportunity to be able to do this stuff and also provide for your family. And that makes it tough. And I also think it makes it tough to get, a ton of quality content. I mean, we always joke and talk about, the NFL should have full-time referees and officials so they can concentrate on it. Well, the same goes for something like this. If you're doing this as a hobby, that's awesome that you don't have to have it, be your bread and butter in terms of financial. But with anything, if you're doing something half the time, you're not quite doing it all the way. So I don't know where it goes. I think in a lot of ways, I'm very fortunate with the team that I work for. Obviously, it's not quite like working for the newspaper, but I have a lot more leeway than maybe a lot of other team writers might. And I think if teams were willing to embrace that a little bit more, I think it would benefit the fans a bit more. But the reality is that most teams aren't comfortable with that situation, and there's going to be more people like me and less people that are covering it for outside interests, just because nobody's paying these people to do it.
All right, let's get to a little bit to the football team. It was a clean sweep in the offseason. Let's start with the new general manager. What do you like about him? What does he bring to the organization that maybe it hasn't had before?
Well, I think Monty Ford is a guy that he worked in the Patriots organization for about a decade. He's been working for the Titans the last few years. He brings a different viewpoint. I mean, this organization, the Cardinals, had not gone outside to hire a GM in 30 years,
Oh, wow.
at least. So I think it's one of those things where I think a new perspective was needed, a new thought process was needed, and that's what Monty Ford has brought. And obviously, everybody saw that on draft night in terms of the wheeling and dealing, and not only what they did for this past draft, but how they have it set up for next draft. So I think in a lot of ways this organization needed the reset and the breakdown that he has provided so far, and we can only see where it plays out from here. But I think it's been a good step forward.
He brings in the defensive coordinator from Philadelphia. It's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people over the years who suggest that I ask, well, is it easier, better? Does it make a difference, offensive, defensive type guy as the head coach? And a lot of people tell me that you can do defense. The problem is if the offense gets to rolling, then you're looking to replace an offensive coordinator every couple of years. If the team does well, harder kind of to do that than it is defense. Why do you think that they decided to go defensively minded as the head coach this time around?
I mean, I think it's happenstance that Jonathan Gannon is a defensive coach. Now, maybe his mindset comes from him being a defensive coach, but I think ultimately it was the mindset that Jonathan Gannon brought to the table that Monty Ossenfort really liked more than whether he was offense or defense. This team has gone offense many times. Well, Steve Wilkes for his 1 year, he was a defensive coach, but Cliff Kingsbury, Ken Wisnant, Bruce Arians, they were all offensive coaches. And I think what you brought up was a factor in that, which is if you get an offense that's rolling, and especially in today's NFL, it's so easy to lose your offensive coordinator, and then you're kind of taking a step back, or you worry about taking a step back. But I think in the end, like I said, I think Gannon brought the mentality that they're looking for, the accountability that they're looking for, and they're hoping that the rest of it can fall into place. And it's not like a defensive coach can't succeed in this league, but yeah, there's a lot riding on what happens with Drew Petzing at offensive coordinator, and beyond that, what happens with Kyler Murray when he comes back and how well he can play. That's going to obviously dictate a lot of where this team goes in the next year or two.
When do you think he'll be back? Do they hope? Do they have a hope line?
Nothing that they're telling us. I mean,
Right.
He's on the PUP list right now, which means he can't practice or play for at least 4 weeks. Since he hasn't actually practiced since he hurt his knee in December, you would figure he would need at least 2 or 3 weeks at least to practice before he'd be ready to play a game. So you're probably talking near midseason, I think, in a realistic scenario. But one thing that this coaching staff has done, one thing this organization has done, and one thing that Kyler Murray has done himself is hold any thought process close to the chest. I know he did an interview with our in-house flight plan episode over the offseason and talked about his goal had been to be back week 1. And people kind of ran with that. But I think that was one of those, hey, I'm a player. I should always be striving for the best possible scenario. I don't think it was ever realistic, even in his own head. And right now they need him to be healthy before he gets back on the field.
It's all over Twitter at this point. And I know that's a dangerous way to start any sentence, but there's this idea now that with the NIL and the money that the players are making, that you could have these situations where players could start dictating where they want to go. We don't see it very often. That's kind of what you hear rumblings about with the number 1 pick next year. What do you think that they think about him as the quarterback? What do you think the long-term plan will be there at quarterback with Kyler Murray? That there is no such thing as tanking, but when the quarterback doesn't play for, let's say, half a year, maybe a full year, it's easier to move those pieces off and wonder what's going on there in Phoenix.
I mean, that's a fair question. I've answered a lot of these at this point in the season like this. One, I know there was a lot of talk that Kyler might not play this season. I absolutely believe he will play this season. I don't know how much, but I absolutely think he's going to play because I think it's necessary for the organization to be able to see him on the field. And I think it's necessary for Kyler to be able to show what he can do coming off this injury. I don't think you want to go into next offseason either as the team or as the player with that question mark. That's number 1. Number 2, and I know there's a lot of talk about Caleb Williams and what might happen and this and that. I think ultimately the best case scenario for the Arizona Cardinals would be for Kyler Murray to be the franchise quarterback that they think he can be going forward. I know they've got high draft picks, but if you get Kyler Murray playing to the level that you want him to. And he wasn't that far off it when he was doing well a couple of years ago. I mean, he's a Pro Bowl quarterback. He was a Rookie of the Year. It's not like he was not good. If you can get him to that level, then all of a sudden you don't have to take a quarterback. Then all of a sudden you could spin one of those two first-round picks into a bounty, perhaps, if some other team wants to trade up, and you're that much further ahead in rebuilding this roster and resetting this roster with some massive talent, first-round talent, based on that one pick. And obviously they've got two because they also own Houston. So I think I'm not going to sit here and say that there won't be conversations at some point about what other quarterbacks are available. That could end up happening. But I think right now the Cardinals' hope is that Kyler comes back and plays well because, like I said, I think their best case scenario is him being the quarterback. And we're not even getting into the fact, especially when you talk about Twitter, all the Twitter news coming out right before we recorded this, that Joe Burrow might be on the verge of getting a contract, that by the time Kyler gets to next season, that big contract he signed, he'll still be top 10, but he's not going to be top 5 anymore. All of a sudden, if he's your franchise quarterback, you've got him on an affordable deal given where all the other quarterbacks are. So it makes so much sense for this team to have Kyler be successful that I think at this point in the conversation, it's kind of silly to think, they're absolutely moving on. That doesn't make any sense to me.
It never made much sense to me either. You've already got him. He's already been paid well. And to your point, those first round picks, I mean, Lord knows what you'd get back for the number one overall. Is it overstated? I think the other reason that we get into this conversation, right, is because there's this assumption that when you get a new GM, the new GM will automatically want all his own stuff. But if you're a GM and you've been gifted a former number one overall quarterback that's been fairly successful, there's not necessarily a need to do that. Do you think do we just assume too much that new GMs want new stuff?
Well, I mean, obviously there's been over the last year and a half, 2 years, even his whole career, there's been a lot said about Kyler Murray, especially on the outside. And I understand the questions and everything. But I mean, I go back, I've been around this team obviously since 2000. So I've seen a lot of stuff. And, when Ken Whisenhunt came in, Ken Whisenhunt was the coach that took this team to the Super Bowl. And I think they needed his coaching to get that team to where it ended up being in the Super Bowl against the Steelers. But so many of those players came from the previous regime with Dennis Green and Rod Graves, including the holdover quarterback, it turned out, with Kurt Warner. So I think any smart GM is going to be smart with what he does. And if they believe Kyler Murray, and again, this is another reason why they got to get him on the field this year so they can see what he has. I think if you think Kyler Murray is a good player, then just to move off him because he's not your guy seems very short-sighted to me. And again, like I said, if you just look at the math says they're better off keeping Kyler Murray if he can do that job and spin their assets in other directions, and they would just build the team so much faster.
If Dobbs is the starter opening day, is he an upgrade over McCoy? And by how much? I guess the move surprised me a little bit. Did it surprise you?
Well, it surprised me because we spent the entire offseason assuming Colt was going to be the number one guy and not really being told anything different. Just a couple of weeks before he got released, the offensive coordinator was talking about leaning on Colt McCoy this season. So I think some things changed in terms of opportunity. The Cardinals did have word trying to sign Josh Dobbs as a free agent early in the offseason. How that would have changed how the offseason went, I don't know. I mean, since Josh Dobbs came to the team, we went to regular season practice rules, which meant we only get to see like the first 20 minutes of practice. So I have no idea if Josh Dobbs is an upgrade over Colt McCoy because I don't get to see him in anything but, basically throwing on air. I think they felt that was possible, that it was better to move off of Colt. Now, with McCoy, he was dealing with an elbow thing since last season. He didn't miss any practice time. He only had a couple training camp practices where he kind of low-keyed it. He practiced, but he wouldn't throw like twice. But there were times when he struggled. He struggled a little bit in Minnesota when there were the joint practices with the Vikings. So I guess I'm not completely surprised. But I mean, this team's also looked at Clayton Tune, the rookie, the 5th-round rookie, a lot, and to bring in a guy like Dobbs, who's going to be here for a week and a half, and have him potentially start, that's eye-opening. There's no question about it. But there is history between Drew Petzing, the offensive coordinator, and Dobbs because of their time in Cleveland. I do think he understands the offense. The guy is a rocket scientist after all, so he's got the smarts to do it. And I guess we will see on Sunday. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of momentum, I guess, and talk that around here that Dobbs probably gets the start. And when I say around here, I don't mean in the building. I mean from outside speculation. Yeah. And I could see that just because I don't know if you want to put a 5th-round rookie on the field to start the season against a defensive front like Washington's. But we're going to see where this goes. I thought all along, whether it was Josh Dobbs or Colt McCoy or Clayton Tune, the storyline of this season in a lot of ways was when can Kyler come back and what does he look like when he comes back? And the rest of this, quite frankly, is we're kind of biding some time. They're going to try and win games. They want to win games. But the overarching story is still going to be what does Kyler look like when he's back on the field?
I looked at the depth chart before we got started today. I am familiar with the tackles. I am less familiar with the interior of this offensive line, which seems to get more important by the year as the defensive tackles get bigger and faster and defensive kind of changes that we're now feels like we're rushing inside out, where it used to be we definitely wanted tackles and edge rushers. What does the interior of this line look like, and will it be a problem?
Well, I mean, the reality is Washington has got one of the better defensive lines in the league, period. Sure. It didn't really matter who the offensive line was going to be for the Cardinals. That is something that the Cardinals were going to have to pay close attention to. They've got Will Hernandez at right guard, who played for the Giants for a number of years. He's been solid. He had a solid season last year, I thought. So I think they feel pretty comfortable there. At left guard, they got a guy named Elijah Wilkinson, who's been with a couple different teams, kind of came out of nowhere, but he's basically held down that role all through the offseason, so nobody's been really able to surpass him. And we'll see what that looks like. And at center, that's been a story from jump. They signed Yelda Froholt from the Browns, who has played in 4 NFL games as a center, regular season games, and started 3. And there were massive questions. Now, that said, in the preseason, when he has played and in training camp, I thought he's looked pretty solid. Now, what that means in a regular season game, we will see. But I like what he brings to the table. I do think their offensive line can be fairly solid. But we are going to see that first test right out of the box with what the Commanders do. And I don't know what that looks like, quite frankly. And I'm not sure anybody is really sure what it will look like.
To me, and maybe I'm off here, the receiving core is filled with guys that when they came out of college, I really thought were going to be very good. And maybe they just haven't gotten the kind of start to their careers that I thought they would have. What are they hoping to get out of their receivers last year? Because I think there's talent in the room.
Well, obviously they moved on from DeAndre Hopkins. So you've got some guys that, Marquise Hollywood Brown is probably going to be essentially your number one, as you might say. He's probably better suited as a number 2. But I do think that he's got a lot to play for. He's going into his contract season. He was playing actually pretty well last year before he hurt his foot as Hopkins' replacement early last year when Hopkins was suspended the first 6 games. So I think this offense might suit him a little bit better. Maybe than what he was doing last year and trying to be that number 1 guy. Rondale Moore is a guy who's basically been injured the whole time. Like, he's had his moments, but he's been hurt too much. And that was part of his problem in school at Purdue. And he's got a lot to prove that he can stay on the field. And then the other starting receiver right now is a rookie, Michael Wilson, who went to Stanford. And here's another guy who was injured a lot in college, but he's been healthy all offseason. And they really like him. And he's a guy that he might be one of those guys. I'm certainly not going to compare him to Terry McLaurin right now because that's not unfair. But again, Terry McLaurin, a guy who was drafted in the 3rd round, people kind of knew him, but I don't think anybody thought he was going to end up being who he's become. And I think they kind of hope that Michael Wilson can be that guy. I mean, both Brown and Moore are short and small, and Michael Wilson's got size. They've got Zach Pascal too with some size, but I think Michael Wilson is the guy that they want to have really turn into that dude for them. And I love his attitude. Again, went to Stanford, super smart, hard worker. He's just got to be able to stay on the field and make the plays.
The Commanders averaged just under 19 points a game. I mean, that will be, if they have any chances of getting anywhere close to where they want to go, it will be that. They've got weapons to do it. I looked at, again, when I was looking at the depth chart, it looks like, and I know most teams aren't really in a base anymore. It looks like this is set up as a base 34 defense. Is that what it is, or is that just really kind of for paper?
I think, again, Doug, this league is about sub packages on defense so often. The base defense rarely pops, but the way they're set up, yes, it's a 3-4 defense. Now, will they have lots of situations where they go with a nickel and that ends up taking away maybe a down lineman in certain situations rather than a linebacker? Probably, given the people that they have and the talent they have. I could see a lot of situations where it kind of looks a little bit like a 2-5 or a 2-4-5 more than regular nickel. But they do have their outside pass rushers are linebackers. That's how they're listing them. They're going to go with the 3-man line, and quite frankly, they've put more draft capital into the outside linebackers than the linemen right now, so it makes sense to get more of those guys on the field at the point. But their defense is something that you're going to have to, for instance, we're not real sure where the pass rush comes from at this point. Like their number one guy at outside linebacker probably is Zaven Collins, who was a 1st-round pick, but they drafted him to be an inside linebacker, and he's playing outside linebacker for the first time. And so where does where does that come from? How does he perform? Does Dennis Gardeck be able to kind of get back some of his pass rushing ability that he had in 2020, that he's kind of an undersized guy. BJ Ojolari, their 2nd-round pick, hasn't done a whole lot because he's coming off knee surgery. Cam Thomas, who was a 3rd-round pick. I mean, there's lots of names and possibilities, but we don't know what kind of production we're actually going to see out of him.
Is Ledbetter from Georgia still there?
Yes, he is. And I like the 3 guys that they have as their quote-unquote starters on the defensive line, and they will absolutely be a rotation kind of team. I like where their heads are at, and they actually perform pretty decently in preseason and training camp. Ledbetter's one, Lucky Fotu, who was a 4th-round pick for this team in 2020, and then L.J. Collier, the former 1st-round pick out of Seattle, who just flamed out in Seattle. They let him walk as a free agent. He's actually played well in the preseason, and he's on a 1-year deal, and he's one of those guys that like, hey, I'm on a new team. I better show something or my career is going to fizzle quickly. So he's motivated, and I think he's actually done a pretty good job this preseason.
I'm a lifelong Georgia fan, so I try to keep up with the Dogs where they go. Quickly, what happened with Isaiah Simmons? Was that did they try to put too much there? Were they just not able to find the right spot for him, or was that a him problem?
I think ultimately the Isaiah Simmons thing came down to a couple things. One, finding him a spot on the field where it made sense for him all the time was definitely a factor. I also think that, again, when you bring in a new coach and a new GM, you're kind of getting a new you're doing your new culture and you're kind of doing an overhaul. And there's some guys that just don't fit into what you're trying to do. And I think there's a possibility that Isaiah Simmons was one of those guys. I definitely think that's kind of what happens with DeAndre Hopkins a little bit was, the big part for Hopkins obviously was he was going to be due $19 million in salary or whatever, or $21 million in salary. And that just didn't make sense to them, but also trying to have him fit into the culture and where they were going. And I think to maybe a lesser extent, that was part of it with Isaiah. Give him a chance to get a fresh start. And we'll see what happens, what he does in the NFC East with the Giants, but I think that was ultimately the big thing, was just like they're trying to get their roster and their locker room in a certain place. And I just think they felt like moving him from Isaiah, especially since he was going into a contract year and it seemed unlikely that he was going to re-sign here long term, it just made sense to do that right now.
Darren, if the Cardinals are to have a season in which they don't end up with the first overall pick, how will they do that?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day. Like, when you look at the two most popular things to do when you get to an NFL season, in a lot of ways, is you pick who's going to play and win the Super Bowl, and then and people don't necessarily pick this, but it's popular to like, oh, this team is going to be so bad, they're definitely going to get the number one pick. And I feel like for the most part, just like picking a Super Bowl winner is really difficult, I think the same thing goes for the number one pick. I don't think it's any lock that this team ends up with the number one overall pick. I mean, I think there's a hill to climb. Their schedule is difficult. Their roster still needs help in a lot of places. Their best quarterback is out for now. That's the biggest thing.
Right.
But I think when you get a new coach and a lot of young guys that are trying to do something, I don't think if there's any lock that this team has a super poor season and they're going to end up with a number one pick. I know that's not what they're thinking right now. Now, could it happen? It absolutely could happen. But I'm not. I can't say that yet. Let's see where we are. Let's see where we are a few weeks into the season in terms of where they end up. And if they don't end up with a number one pick, I mean, again, they're going to have 2 first-round picks, themselves and the Texans. Wherever those end up, I'm sure Monty is going to have the ability to do some things with them. They've got, I think, if you add in the probable compensatory pick that they're going to get, they're going to have 13 or 12 or 13 picks as it stands right now in next year's draft. So I think they're going to be well suited to get guys or move around if that's what Monty Osiport wants to do. So I think they're going to be in a solid spot no matter where they're picking.
All right, Darren, what do you think the score looks like on Sunday?
I wish I could tell you. I'm not a huge score predictor guy, to be honest. And what makes it more difficult is I don't even know who's playing quarterback for this team. I think Sam Howell's done some nice things in the preseason, but I don't know what Washington looks like. I saw a short video clip of McLaurin at least doing some things at practice, so maybe it's trending that he'll be able to play, but we don't know about him. We don't know about Chase Young. And I've been doing this for so long. There is no more crazy week in the NFL than week one, because inevitably there's like 4 teams that win games and or lose games that you're like, wow, how did that happen? So it's really, I mean, if this was mid-season and I knew for sure the Cardinals were going to be this team and the Commanders were going to be this team, you know, I could see like something like 20-14, something like that. But like, I just don't know. And I've rarely been this clueless about a team I've covered, but I really, really don't know what this is going to look like when the season starts.
Do you travel with the team to Washington?
I do, yes.
Well, we wish you a safe flight out there. What are you working on article-wise? What's coming up next for you?
Well, today, after I get off of this, I'm going to start working on a quarterback story, because even though Jonathan Gannon made it very clear yet again today that he will not be announcing who the quarterback would be, that's still a story of who they might have. And then I did post a big story that, who knows, might actually be of some interest, because it's not just about the Cardinals, but I did post a story yesterday about Hollywood Brown and Gus Johnson giving him the Hollywood nickname when he was playing in college. And I got to talk to Gus Johnson about that. So I think that's an interesting read all the way around about Marquise Brown and kind of where he is in his career and getting that nickname. So that's something to check out.
All right, Darren, I know you're busy and I appreciate your time today. I enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me.